Chris, how are you?
Good, Graham. Thanks.
Thanks for taking time to join us today.
Sure.
You know, I honestly, it's hard to know where to begin but I want to talk about the plague of isolation that you just wrote on Substack, because yesterday I put out a tweet saying we've had 33 mass shootings in the first 23 days of the new year. And less than 8 hours later, there was another shooting in California. The two most recent ones were in California. So 34 shootings in 23 days. And it's only a little after 11 a.m. here on the West Coast. So who knows if there's another one that's already happened today. And, you know, America, the Farewell Tour, and even, Death of the Liberal Class, which came out in 2010, and that really sort of helped me open my eyes up to the, as you call it, and very aptly call it, the 4 decades long corporate coup. And as someone who in the last year or so has been back traveling around America, and I'm seeing American cities just boarded up buildings, homelessness, basically everything you describe in your Substack article. And that it really rang for me what you said. You talk about your local gym, and you used to be a boxer, you work out, and all these different guys with different backgrounds, but you'd meet at the gym. And, you know, you describe this gym, it's dirty, it's old, it's this and that, but it was your spot. It was your place. Like, I know gyms like that. I've trained in gyms like that. And, you know, I'm sitting here watching America, and a year or so ago, I thought we were going to have this monumental collapse. Just this January 6th insurrection was going to go on for months, and we were going to be in a civil war. But I don't know. I'm looking at everything, seeing just this kind of slow decay, and Americans have been so propagandized by the ruling elites that things will get bad, and the ruling elites will just throw out some crumbs, and that'll kind of quell the dissent, and America just kind of fumble along. I mean, you look at, like, gas was $6 a gallon. Oh, now it's $4. Oh, we're all good again. So how do you see where America goes from this point? Because I don't know. I mean, some empires, you know, you're a historian, have taken 50, 100 years to slowly collapse or erode. But where do you see America going from here? I mean, it's pretty despondent, and I don't know how we come out of this.
Well, we're replicating all of the late stages of empire, of any empire. And of course, what fuels that is rampant, unchecked, unregulated militarism, which engages in, one kind of military fiasco after another. We go all the way back to Vietnam, trillions and trillions of dollars, not to mention all of the lives and the suffering, not only of Americans and their families, but the Vietnamese, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Afghans. Nobody's ever held accountable. In fact, the architects of these debacles are just promoted upwards until they end up on the boards of Raytheon or Boeing or somewhere else, pulling in, I don't know how much they make, $500,000 a year to sit on those boards.
And then they become Secretary of Defense.
Yeah. Well, Well, then you can go from a board back to secretary. Yeah. What was he on? Rand, I think. So, yeah. And they're all on MSNBC telling us why we should send more Patriot missiles to Ukraine, etc. So that is a very common characteristic to late empires. Would kill the Roman Empire. Arnold Toynbee writes about this, the historian, and what you do is you hollow the country out from the inside. So you're right about all of these cities, and I purposely get out and spend a lot of time as a writer and a reporter in these places because the corporate media has rendered these places invisible. And you're right, it's city after city after city. And America, the Farewell Tour, which you mentioned, is a book that looks at the pathologies that arise from a dysfunctional or decayed society. It uses the studies by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who investigated suicide. He was curious as to what is it that drove individuals and groups and societies to commit collective suicide. And he, I think, correctly targeted what he called anomie, or the rupture of social bonds. All of these forces that knit us to a community, which is what my column was about, the last column I wrote. When they get severed, then when you lose that kind of connectedness to the community, first it triggers a kind of pathology that is expressed in very negative, self-destructive forms. So that's where you get the opioid crisis. Now we're on the East Coast, so they're opening weed shops everywhere, so everybody can take gummies and get high to try to endure. But that's where you get gambling, any kind of these addictive. And what's interesting, you mentioned mass shootings, and there's a chapter in there on hate groups, Proud Boys and Three Percenters, all of whom I spent time with. But Durkheim, I think, correctly points out that those who seek the annihilation of others are driven for longings for self-annihilation. So you see with these mass shootings, they carry out the mass shootings and then they commit suicide. And that book, I stopped asking the question, which I'd done in previous books, about how did we get here and where are we going, and just looked at the consequences. So I think that with the destruction of an organized left, which has been, again, decades in the making, especially labor unions, any kind of collective empowerment has been gone. And those unionized workers, like the freight railway workers who still retain the power for collective bargaining, have had it stripped from them by legislative fiat from our quote-unquote pro-labor president. So that utter disempowerment, coupled with these ruptures of social bonds, and the inability on the state to respond in a meaningful way to any of these issues. We know that half of the country lives in, I think it's 63% are living paycheck to paycheck, but roughly half the country's living in poverty or near poverty, economic instability, no hope of a future. I mean, these young kids, I have them who are getting out. There are no jobs for them, no jobs where they can make a sustainable income. I mean, there might be temp work here and there. And meanwhile, we've just sent upwards of $100 billion to Ukraine in military and humanitarian assistance. The State Department's annual budget's only $60 billion. 100 million, that's more than 10 government departments combined, including the EPA and so the CDC and everything else. So it's out of control, and it's bipartisan in that sense, that on the issue of endless war, on the issue of trade deals, on the issues of wholesale surveillance, we're the most monitored, eavesdropped, photographed population in human history. And I, as a reporter, I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. When the government watches you 24 hours a day, you can't use the word liberty. That's the relationship of a master and a slave. All of these issues, there's no difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. They will argue over cultural issues, and I don't want to in any way minimize the right of a woman to control her own body, of course, but on the fundamental structural, economic, military issues, there's no daylight between the two parties, nor has there been for a long time. In fact, of course, the irony is that on endless war, the Democrats are now worse. There is more opposition within the Republican Party. I forget the numbers, 53 in the House or something, but there's actually more opposition from the Republicans than there is on the Democrats.
Yeah, and you bring up such an excellent point, to pass this so-called environmental bill that, the Congress and the Senate were fighting over this tooth and nail. And then even, as you say, Roe v. Wade, which is a very significant piece of legislation, it's not to be minimized. They're fighting on this tooth and nail. But then very quietly during all these fights, $858 billion bipartisan. They both agreed to it without not even a sneeze, man. Like nobody even nobody even made a dirty look on the floor of the Senate. Everybody just goes along, and the press just goes along with it. And I've seen this, as you say, like we haven't had a draft in this country because we don't need one. We've had economic conscription. When I did comedy tours, I did 7 of them in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I saw, especially after the financial crash of I went Afghanistan 04, 06, 07, and I was in Iraq 07, 08, and 2011. And after the 2008 crash, I really saw a lot of these, like you say, young people had no opportunities. I met these young guys, 25, 20, some of them 28 on their 3rd tour. And I'm like, why are you coming back here a 3rd time? Well, I got a $20,000 reenlistment bonus. And back in fill in the blank town, America, there's no jobs. There's the Walmart, there's fast food, or there's dealing opioids, or there's the army. Those are the choices. And
yeah, exactly. And my family comes from many of those towns in Maine, in rural Maine. And you're right. I mean, and the decay, because I remember what these towns were like. They never had money, of course, but I remember what they were like when I was a boy. They were functional towns. Now, everything's boarded up. Even the town my grandparents are from, the bank is boarded up. And what the Democrats do is rhetorically they're better, but they never follow through. So if you remember, go back to the campaign, the Biden campaign and the Democratic campaign, they were all promising to raise the minimum wage. They promised a national paid family and medical leave program, allowing people to take 12 weeks of paid time. They promised to impose a federal tax hike on corporations going up to 21%, I think, or 28%. They proposed to pass legislation to ensure that super PACs would be independent of campaigns and political parties. And then they had to mount their midterm election campaign, which combined cost both parties $16.7 billion. Well, who paid for it? I mean, all these PACs and corporations that they were supposedly going to assault. So the Democrats routinely say the right thing, but they serve the billionaire class as slavishly as the Republican Party.
Oh, so much so. I mean, the candidates in the 2020 Democratic primary, the two that got the 2 most donations from billionaires was Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. I mean, and then in looking at, I checked up on the defense industry donations and for the 2020, and they spent a total of $49 million, I think, across all candidates in 2020. The top 3, number 3, Bernie Sanders, $800,000. Number 2, Donald Trump, $2.7 million, and then Joe Biden at $3.1 million. So the defense industry hedged their bets that whoever's in there, we're going to have war. And like you say, and I think probably because more sort of conservatives' children signed up to defend America and the freedom, and liberal kids weren't necessarily signing up post 9/11 at the numbers that the conservative kids were. This is just my sort of estimate, which is why I believe that more Republicans are like, wait a minute with this war stuff. But even then, it's still just like when you watch the mainstream media, it's when one party is in power, the other party, usually their criticism is, hey, you're not doing war the right way. It's rarely do we hear even like no more war. Too much money is being spent. It's too many American lives are lost. We're causing too many problems around the world. It's usually some type of like, well, you're not fighting the war the right way. And I just, having, you were a war correspondent, so you've seen war as up close as a civilian can. And I, as a comedian, I'll know what it's like to be a combat vet. But I've been in field hospitals. I've seen people with missing limbs and wounded kids, and the decimation of war in the community, and then the financial stuff at home. And we have 22 vets a day that commit suicide. And it's all these sort of, as you talk about in your book, your most recent book, and in this column, this sort of all of these symptoms of despair, the opioid epidemic, the suicide, not just among vets, but just people in general. And like you say now, it's just all you have to get through this, because the state isn't going to give you any money. They gave, 100 new billionaires were created during the pandemic with all the stimulus money. Now the best you can get is, like you say, you go to a casino and hopefully maybe you win a couple $100, and then you go eat your pot gummies to numb out because it's just too painful. It's just too brutal. Like I coming back to Los Angeles, I was living kind of traveling and abroad and in Hawaii part of the time, and coming back, I mean, every place I go, the employees are just fried. This isn't a criticism of the employees. They're getting paid horrible wages. The rents are out of control, not just in Los Angeles, but nationwide. And they're just like, yeah, fine, thank you. You want a receipt? Or they're like, I can tell they're kind of on something to get through the day. Or they're stoned, or I mean, like, it's abject misery. And you know, you had some on your show on Contact before the State Department shut down, because we love freedom of speech so much, we shut down Russian TV. You had someone on your show who was, I forget the woman's name, who was talking about Yugoslavia and how leading up to that horrific in the 90s, how people were programmed to fight with each other through media and news. And I'm really starting to sense that now, because everybody's sort of fried and burnt out and stressed, that then they've really ramped up the fighting with each other thing. And part of it goes to your article about it's easy to get everybody fighting with each other when we're isolated. If you and I are like again, you weren't arguing with your guys at the gym, even though maybe you had some political talks or whatever, but you're not going to be rude in an argument face to face. On the internet, it's easy to write F you, right, suck it or whatever. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. We are still in our 9th month of demonetization from YouTube. So support what we're doing at patreon.com/Graham Elwood or rockfin.com/Graham Elwood, which is a blockchain cryptocurrency platform. It's free to sign up, and there's a premium level at $10 a month. And for that, you get everybody on the platform's premium content. Myself, Lee Camp, Ron Placone, Jimmy Dore, Whitney Webb, Kim Iverson, Abby Martin, and many, many others. You can also support what we're doing at Venmo at Graham-Elwood, and go to GrahamElwood.com. We have a PayPal button and a PO box. I also have crypto wallets, which are all in the show notes. Thanks for supporting what we do.